Island, Chapter 14. The First Blow. I was so pleased at having given the slip to Long John that I began to enjoy myself and look around me with some interest on the strange land that I was in. I had crossed a marshy tract full of willows, bulrushes, and odd, outlandish, swampy trees. I had now come out upon the skirts of an open piece of undulating sandy country about a mile long, dotted with a few pines and a great number of contorted trees not unlike the oak in growth, but pale in foliage like willows. On the far side of the open stood one of the hills, with two quaint craggy peaks shining vividly in the sun. I now felt for the first time the joy of exploration. The island was uninhabited. My shipmates I had left behind, and nothing lived in front of me but dumb brutes and fowls. I turned hither and thither among the trees. Here and there were flowering plants unknown to me. Here and there I saw snakes. One raised his head from a ledge of rock and hissed at me with a noise not unlike the spitting of a top. Little did I suppose that he was a deadly enemy and that the noise was a famous rattle. Then I came to a long thicket of these oak-like trees, live or evergreen oaks I heard them they should be called, which grew low along the sand like brambles. The boughs curiously twisted, the foliage compact like thatch. The thicket stretched down from the top of one of the sandy knolls, spreading and growing taller as it went, until it reached the margin of broad, reefy fen, through which the nearest of the little rivers soaked its way into the anchorage. The marsh was steaming in the strong sun. The outline of the spyglass trembled through the haze. All at once there began to go a sort of bustle among the bulrushes. A wild duck flew up with a quack, another followed, and soon over the whole surface of the marsh a great cloud of the birds hung screaming and circling in the air. I judged at once that some of my shipmates must be drawing near along the borders of the fen. Nor was I deceived, for soon I heard the very distant and low tones of a human voice, which, as I continued to give ear, grew steadily louder and nearer. This put me in great fear, and I crawled under the cover of the nearest live oak and squatted there, hearkening and silent as a mouse. Another voice answered, and then the first voice, which I now recognized to be Silver's, once more took up the story and ran on for a long while in the stream, only now and again interrupted by the other. But the sound they must have been talking earnestly and almost fiercely, but no distinct word came to my hearing. At last the speakers seemed to have paused, and perhaps to have sat down, for not only did they cease to draw any nearer, but the birds themselves began to grow more quiet and settle again to their places in the swamp. And I now began to feel that I was neglecting my business, that since I had been so foolhardy as to come ashore with these desperadoes, the least I could do was overhear them at their councils, and that my plain and obvious duty was to draw as close as I could manage, under the favorable ambush of the crouching trees. I could tell the direction of the speakers pretty exactly, not only by the sound of their voices, but by the behavior of the few birds that still hung in alarm above the heads of the intruders. Crawling on all fours, I made steadily but slowly toward them, till at last I raised my head to an aperture among the leaves. I could see clear down into a little green dell beside the marsh, and closely set about with trees, where Long John Silver and another of the crew stood face to face in conversation. The sun beat full upon them. Silver had thrown his hat beside him on the ground, and his great smooth blond face, all shining with heat, was lifted to the other man's in a kind of appeal. "Mate," he was saying, "it's because I think gold dust of you. Gold dust, that you may lay to that. If I hadn't took you to you like a pitch, do you think I'd have been here a warning of you? All's up. You can't make or mend. It's to save your neck that I'm speaking. And if one of the wild ones knew it, where'd I be? Tom, now tell me, where'd I be?" "Silver," said the other man, and I observed he was not only red in the face, but spoke as hoarse as a crow, and his voice shook too like a taut rope. "Silver," says he, "you're old and you're honest, or has the name for it, and you're money too, which lots of poor sailors hasn't, and you're brave, and I'm mistook. And will you tell me that you'll let yourself be led away with that kind of a mess of swabs? Not you. As sure as God sees me, I'd sooner lose my hand if I turned again my duty." And all of a sudden he was interrupted by a noise. I had found one of the oddest lads. Well, here at the same moment came news of another. Far away out in the marsh there arose all of a sudden a sound like a cry of anger, then another on the back of it, and then one horrid, long, drawn-out scream. The rocks of the spyglass re-echoed it a score of times. The whole troop of marsh birds rose again, darkening heaven, with a simultaneous whir. The long-after-death yell was still ringing in my brain. Silence had re-established its empire, and the only rustle of the redescending birds and the boom of distant surges disturbed the languor of the afternoon. Tom had leaped at the sound like a horse at the spur, but Silver had not winked an eye. He stood where he was, resting lightly on his crutch, watching his companion like a snake about to spring. "John," said the sailor, stretching out a hand. "Hands off," cried Silver, leaping back a yard, as if it seemed to me with the speed and security of a trained gymnast. "Hands off if you like, John Silver," said the other. "It's a black conscience that you can make you feared of me. But in heaven's name tell me, what was that?" "That," returned Silver, smiling away, but warier than ever, his eye a mere pinpoint on his big face, but gleaming like a crumb of glass. "Oh, I reckon that'll be Allen." And at this point Tom flashed out like a hero. "Allen!" he cried. "Then rest his soul for a true seaman. And as for you, John Silver, long you've been a mate of mine, but you're a mate of mine no more. If I die like a dog, I'll die in my duty. You've killed Allen, haven't you? Kill me if you can, but I defies you." And with that, this brave fellow turned his back directly on the cook and set off walking for the beach. He was not destined to go far. With a cry, John seized the branch of a tree, whipped the crutch out of his armpit, and sent that uncouth missile hurtling through the air. It struck poor Tom point foremost with stunning violence, right between the shoulders in the middle of his back. His hands flew up, he gave a sort of gasp and fell. Whether he were injured much or little, none could ever tell. But like enough to judge from the sound, his back was broken on the spot. But he had no time to be given him to recover. Silver, agile as a monkey even without a leg or crutch, was on top of him the next moment, and he had twice buried his knife up to the hilt in that defenseless body. From my place of ambush I could hear him pant aloud as he struck the blows. I do not know what it rightly is to faint, but I do know that for the next little while the whole world swam away from me in a whirling mist. Silver and the birds and the tall spyglass hilltop going round and round topsy-turvy before my eyes, and all manner of bells ringing and distant voices shouting in my ear. When I came again to myself, the monster had pulled himself together, his crutch under his arm, his hat upon his head. Just before him, Tom lay motionless upon the sward, but the murderer minded him not a whit, cleansing his blood-stained knife the while upon a wisp of grass. Everything else was unchanged. The sun was still shining mercilessly upon the steaming marsh and the tall pinnacle of the mountain, and I could scarce persuade myself that murder had actually been done, and a human life cruelly cut short a moment before my eyes. But now John put his hand into his pocket, brought out a whistle, and blew upon it several modulated blasts that rang far across the heated air. I could not tell, of course, the meaning of the signal, but it instantly woke my fears. More men would be coming. I might be discovered. They had already slain 2 of the honest people, after all, Tom and Allen. Might I not come next? Instantly I began to extricate myself and crawl back again, with what speed and silence I could manage, to the more open portion of the wood. As I did so, I could hear hails coming and going between the old buccaneer and his comrades, and this sound of danger lent me wings. As soon as I was clear of the thicket, I ran as I never ran before, scarce minding the direction of my flight, so long as it led me from the murderers. And as I ran, fear grew and grew upon me until it turned into a kind of frenzy. Indeed, could anyone be more entirely lost than I? When the gun fired, how should I dare go down to the boats among these fiends, still smoking from their crime? Would not the first of them who saw me wring my neck like a snipe's? Would not my absence itself be evidence of my alarm, and therefore my fatal knowledge? It was all over, I thought. Goodbye to the Hispaniola, goodbye to the squire, the doctor, and the captain. There was nothing left for me but death by starvation or death by the hands of the mutineers. All this while, as I say, I was still running, and without taking notice, I had drawn near to the foot of the little hill with two peaks, and had got into the part of the island where the live oaks grew more widely apart, and seemed more like forest oaks in their bearing and dimensions. Mingled with these were a few scattered pines, some 50, some near 70 feet high. The air smelt more freshly than down beside the marsh. And here a fresh alarm brought me to a standstill with a thumping heart. This is the end of chapter 14. So, two of the honest crewmen are dead now. Jim is running scared. So it looks like Long John's plot, the mutiny, is in action. Now, I want to talk about the plants because, the mutiny is in action, and we'll hear what happens to that in the next chapter, or perhaps even chapters after that. But now he talked about the trees being weirdly bent. Now, trees bend according to the wind. So if you have a constant wind from one direction, the trees actually grow bent in the wind. So if the wind blows like this, the trees get blown over like this on a regular manner. They stay like this. They grow actually like this with one side longer than the other, and they grow with a nice curve in them. Also, on trees and bushes on the beach, on the shore. Inland, they're normal trees, but when they're out on the beach, they get stunted by the salt, and they get twisted by the wind because the wind blows this way and the wind blows that way. The wind blows in the morning and out at the evening, or the other way around. Blows out in the morning, in at the evening because of the temperature differences. But, the wind blows back and forth and then up and down the coast, and the beach is always just very windy because of these long fetches of water. So the trees right up against the shore are tight and twisted and gnarled. But inland, the same variety of tree can grow tall and straight. So that's a difference that you see. I don't think there's any rattlesnakes that live in tropical islands. I always think of them as a mountain snake, but I probably am wrong. They may be rattlesnakes elsewhere, but rattlesnakes are one of the few venomous snakes in North America. You have the rattlesnake, the cottonmouth, the copperhead. That's pretty much all you see in the eastern U.S. The western U.S. has a different rattlesnake, which is bigger, but the eastern one is just meaner. The eastern rattlesnake bites out of meanness. The western rattlesnake, not as much. And I mean, any snake can bite you. Most of them are harmless. So if you see a little snake, don't worry about the little snakes. But, snakes tend to be more afraid of people than people are of snakes. But just don't go approaching them or poking them with sticks, because that's not nice. And, if you're not nice to snakes, they may bite you. But if you're nice to snakes, they're usually mostly okay. Anyway, so twisted brambles, twisted trees, live oaks. This is a fairly good-sized island. Jim's worried about starvation, but I mean, he's clever, he's resourceful. If he gets stuck on the island for 10 years, maybe he can Robinson Crusoe his way out. Build a little fort, catch ducks. Silver said there's goats on the island. I'm sure he could find they're feral goats, so I don't think they're actually wild goats. A lot of the Caribbean islands, a lot of the islands in the world have feral goats and pigs, where the sailors come into the island and they have 4 or 5 goats, 4 or 5 pigs with them. And they just let them loose on the island because they're not going to run away. And what this allows them to do is the goats and the pigs run wild on the island, and they eat and they reproduce. And so when, you come over, you drop off 4 or 5 pigs, you come back, spend a year going over, a year coming back. 2 years later, instead of 4 or 5 pigs, you have 20 pigs. And it's like, hey, bacon. Although, probably not bacon, it's more like roast pork. But anyway, so they'd leave these goats on the islands or they'd leave these pigs on the island, which was horrible for the ecosystem because, I mean, goats and pigs and rats are what really cause most of the mass extinctions of tropical birds. A rat would get loose on, or rats would get loose on an island and start breeding. And there would be these birds that aren't used to things going into the nests and eating the eggs. And for rats, eggs are just an easy meal. So, I mean, that's pretty much what wiped out the dodo and a whole bunch of other things because it's like, oops, we accidentally let some rats on. Or, hey, we introduced pigs so we could come back and get it. I mean, there were islands where they were these beautiful, lush tropic islands and they let a few goats loose. And they come back 50 years later and, like, there's nothing left on the island but some scrub and the goats because the goats ate everything and just destroyed the ecosystem, which is something that people back then didn't really know about, and it's really kind of surprising. I mean, it's not something that you think about, that everything being so intertwined. Yellowstone, where we're going to be going, they did something like that intentionally. They were afraid that the wolves were going to kill all the elk. So Teddy Roosevelt was out there and he's like, oh, there's these wolves and they're killing the elk. He's like, I have a solution. We'll kill the wolves. Well, yeah, that helped the elk grow, but it also caused the elk to overpopulate. And the wolves were also keeping the rabbits in check. And you're like, well, what is the rabbits in check? Well, the rabbits exploded. And because the rabbits exploded and the elk exploded because there weren't the wolves to keep them down, then the trees started pulling back. And when the trees started pulling back, the beavers went away because the beavers need the trees. And you had this whole complete change of the ecosystem because they took out the wolves. And 15, 20 years ago, they started reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone. They're like, hey, this isn't good. It's like destroyed. The trees are going away. The elk are going away. The beaver's gone. And there's rabbits everywhere because the rabbits were eating the food that the elk eat. And there's only so much like the coyotes can do to keep the rabbits in check. But the wolves were just like, easy. So they've reintroduced wolves. And then all of a sudden the trees started growing. And they're like, that's weird. And the elk were in check. And the rabbits were in check. And the beavers came back. And everyone was like, wow. It's like 20 years of just putting the wolves back got a lot of it better. It's not entirely fixed, but it's a lot better. So, Jim Hawkins, running from death, running from Long John Silver. This is getting exciting.